start by doing a brief introduction of each of them. Saeeda, is a highly qualified chemical engineer with a PhD from MIT, and has worked interestingly in different industries in I think most of the world globally, and is the managing director of Alvarez and Marsal, and I think I've worked with them in my Citibank days. Exceptionally good organization. So we look forward to hearing her thoughts on some of the key topics that were discussed this morning. Then we got Michal, who's somebody I've known now for a long time. He used to be sort of like the poster child for digital banking in the old days, because he set up M-Bank in Poland, or most of M-Bank in Poland. And when we used to have discussions earlier on setting up digital and challenger banks, M-Bank was really the place to go to learn how things got done, and things got done well. So thank you, because he was on his way off to important client meeting in India, but he stopped off on his way from London to India to attend this panel. So we are thankful. Michal, of course, has lots of experience. It's not just in M-Bank, but several other organizations, including what we think are traditional organizations, but they're not. They're very forward-looking, and they do a lot of good stuff, one of them being Microsoft. So, he has an MBA from the Harvard Business School, so he brings a good discipline about taking some of our interesting discussions this morning that could be futuristic and actually bringing them down to practical reality, because I think most of today, the discussion is about how we can practically implement digital banking. And then in the right corner is somehow I would define between a friend and family type of person who I've known pretty much from the day he started technology in Citibank, and he's had a very successful career in technology and in operations, and now is presently the CEO of Mashreq Bank, but having spent enough time internationally with Citi and with Barclays and Morgan Stanley and Commercial Bank of Qatar. He's going to give us another practical experience of some of the reality of what works and what doesn't work, because we can get caught with a lot of different ideas. So welcome to everybody. Today, while the discussion was about experience monetization, I think we're going to talk about a little bit about three key themes, and if we have some time, we'll do a fourth theme. The first theme that I want to start with is, and this is very much in connect to what we heard this morning, and finally with the GCB presentation that Rajesh did. We're going to sort of touch on areas that we think are showing enormous opportunity for the future, and we believe is very critical. So the first one is about data. I think there is a phenomenal focus around the potential that data can bring. Banks have not necessarily monetized that data as efficiently, considering that they are actually having most of the data today compared to many of the other FinTechs. The ability to use that data more efficiently, whether it's for contextual decisions, whether it's for personalized decisions, is one part of it. And the second part about it is about privacy and security. So I think what I would start with, and maybe we can begin, Michal, with you, because there's a lot of change taking place with open architecture on the way data is accessed and used. And there is also this belief that there is certain parts of data which are clearly in the open space, and there's another part of data that is very confidential and trust-oriented, which is very important for financial services. And with the whole GDPR regulation on one side and open banking on the other side, getting the right blend between the ability to control the data, at the same time make it useful for the banks to be able to take decisions. So if you can share with us some thoughts around how you see the data monetization for banks, how it should take shape, and what do you think will, based on your experience, will work, and what do you think are the challenges going forward?
Very good. So in terms of data, I've had very hands-on innovations in both mining and building models, and then operating procedures and operating models on top of that. In particular, at M-Bank, where we created one of the first global ecosystems for merchant-funded offers that was scaled to 5 million customers working in real time, and actually bringing customers more benefit in cash back than the deposit interest that they would be getting, which when you think about that is almost a fundamental, challenge of what the core business of banking could be, at least, from the value that you could generate to consumers. And back at Credit Tech, where I was CPO and CIO, we've been using more than 20,000 data points to issue consumer credit on 3 continents in 6 countries, and that's such diverse as Russia, Mexico, India, Poland, Spain, and all of that was run out of Hamburg. And we had customers in Kamchatka, in Tijuana, and they tended to come back, which was nothing else but powered by ability to remotely, assess the willingness and ability to repay of consumers that you have never seen before, and you would have never seen in the future, and still you would know enough to front cash, to them. And when I think about data, well, we have many fads in financial industry, right? As each of us has been following these innovations, these grand pronouncements of the change that's coming, that's going to come over the last 15, 20 years, and most intensely over 10, we've seen all of that probably, and so few of them have really changed the fundamentals of how we generate P&L and balance sheet today. Data is actually one of them when you really think about that. We've been talking about big data, analytics. Now there is no announcement that doesn't have machine learning and AI built into that, even without proper definition of what it really means. And data by itself is fundamental. There is nothing physical in banking at all. We are just capturing, processing, storing, and transmitting information. And anything that we do physical is just a technology, outdated technology with which we process information. But data is just 10% of the story. How many examples out there? Well, probably these days we no longer say big data, right? It's almost like out-fashioned. Unless it's machine learning and AI, it's no longer a proper term. But within BCG, we like to say that data is only 10% of the story. 20% on top of that would be the algorithm and the model which we utilize, but it's still only 30% of what it is. Everything else is about the business process, operating model, talent that we deploy, the way we collaborate together, and the governance that we put around it. How many big data initiatives have ended, either in the bowels of IT or a certain dedicated, analytics team, spearheaded somewhere in the business, and then really the P&L would have not been impacted. And, let me give a kind of very tangible example in one of the fundamental applications where data is important, which is driving digital sales. When you think about digital sales, what it is, it's, our chance to get out of the monopoly of the branch, both in terms of how we deliver the business, how we construct the business model, and also how we provision the business to customers. And branches are 40% of cost base of the typical retail and SME operation. And if we define that digital sales is only about the data, we would have only touched the data collection layer. Most of that actually just would be sufficient and challenging enough to collect internal data that we have. We don't necessarily need to go to all the plethora of external platforms yet. This is just one layer. And the other layer in the big data, ML, AI, would be the analytics team. But that's only 2 core layers out of 4 that we need to have in order to deliver digital marketing and e-commerce, m-commerce model at scale. Because another thing that we need is, the notion of marketing operations. So having a campaign manager that would be able to scale up to hundreds of campaigns that would be running live. That requires actually a lot of people. Content, the text, creative picture, video, connection to the segmentation of customers, particular pricing models for each particular product. We would need to manage marketing compliance, marketing policies, even prioritize campaigns, within, what is optimal for the customer. That's the 3rd layer. It has nothing to do with data. And then on top, also the interaction layer, so how we display those messages to customers, and it's tens of millions of messages that an M-Bank, which would be 5 million customers, have. So data is only 10%, models 20%, the rest is how we run the business.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting point that, real success of digital banks, it's always a question whether digital banks are profitable or not. how are they actually successful? But this is a good way of putting it, that if you actually deliver digital sales efficiently enough, you should be able to justify the fact that a digital bank strategy is bringing you some value. It's not only about the customer experience. Sandeep, you've implemented a digital bank here in the UAE recently. What's your sort of thought of what over here somebody would like to implement a digital bank in their country or a challenger bank? What would you, say are the sort of top few things to look at to make that a successful thing, not just from a technology perspective, but also, from a business perspective, and what has sort of worked here?
Assalamu alaikum, good afternoon. I think a lot has been said and done around utilizing existing data within banks, and we just heard reinforcement around the finding new revenue streams, etc. So not much more can be said about that, but to the topic of monetizing data, we are all consumers of banking ourselves. I find very little has been done in allowing customers themselves to have access to their own data in a very elegant, structured manner, and then offering that as a service that the banks can monetize. And the breadth is limitless. Someone wants to understand, the best that the banks do today is send you a statement of account. So turn the problem on its head. And I'll take an example of Alibaba. And if you talk to their founder, whom we met recently, and he said, all I am is a big data company. The only thing that they do is they monetize their data. So they allow sellers, they charge fees to sellers, not on the commission of the sale, but their ability to see who else is selling the same product in their vicinity or elsewhere. So likewise, banks, a bit like a credit bureau, if I may, could sell a range of capabilities, whether it's transactional, service, credit, behavioral patterns. The point is we don't know the use cases. Empower the clients and take this. I genuinely think, Banesh, so far the banks have done a pretty lousy job of mining the data.
I think
so give it, if there's someone out there who could expose all this data to them, there's so much more that we don't know what the client wants.
Yeah, I think this morning we heard a lot about some of those sort of attitudes and issues that banks have. I think what we're saying is that there is a strong opportunity that will the banks change the way they approach things, like you explained, Alibaba? Will we talk a lot about personalization and contextual banking. The banks have to be able to provide that thought process to make that happen. Is it something that's going to happen soon? I think the open banking mandate, where the customer has the right to give consent for any particular fintech to access data from the banks, is sort of turning this around and saying that the data you have of a customer is actually owned by the customer, and he has a right to provide that data to anybody. Now, this will make its way slowly in other geographies, but I think right now it's very strong, and it gives an enormous opportunity for various fintechs and various businesses to access data to take business decisions better than the banks can. So the ability to be able to get the banks to step up and make this possible is very, very important. I don't know whether, Saeeda, you have anything to sort of share on this.
Yeah, no, I would agree. And I think the fundamental issue here is data is viewed as something in isolation. And I think that's not necessarily the way to look at it. Mm-hmm. So when I think about data, I mean, there's lots of different statistics out there, but the one that always comes to mind for me is there's been more data created in the last 3 years than in the history of mankind. And this trend will continue. This trend is absolutely going to continue. There is a lot of data out there. I don't think the question is about the data. The question is, what do you do with it? Mm. Data is information. Information is power. It's the ability to make better decisions, faster decisions, more efficient decisions. That's ultimately what it comes down to. And I think until banks or any other incumbent organization takes that and incorporates that as part of their decision-making process, it's going to be very difficult for them to react. Now, these decisions are not pie-in-the-sky decisions, but these are fundamental day-to-day decisions that impact the customer, each and every one of us in the room, but they also impact the bank internally.
Sure. And do any of you have a suggestion of how the banks here could actually do that? Because I think we're all saying that we're not doing enough to get this going. So what should we be, what should the banks be doing? Should they be creating a separate group focused on data? Or they should define some key priority user journeys and implement those that have data with, AI and ML built in? Or what exactly, do you believe the folks here should be looking at to make data that they have so much of and so much available there more efficient for themselves?
I can offer my view on this. I think it's very tough for an incumbent to try and change the entire ship and to change the entire direction. Where we have seen this work incredibly well is when existing organizations will actually set up a dedicated group. So be it launch a new bank, be it a specific work group. So currently we are working with multiple different providers on very similar things. But you have to fundamentally create a different team. The mindset of the people has to be very, very different. And this has to percolate across every single aspect of the business. And that's what I mean. So the way the products are created, the way the sales work, the way the customer servicing works, the way the credit decisions work, the way the servicing of the customer works, every single thing has to be different. And you have to start from a zero base. You cannot start from, this is what exists, let me try and incrementally improve it. Because if you do that, you're constantly playing catch up. The best ways in which we have seen this work is you create a ring-fenced team, and you can ring fence it to whatever degree is possible given the specific situation of that bank. And then in that ring fence team, you start from a blank sheet of paper and then you implement something that is really and truly digital. And the only reason to bring in physical is if it's absolutely necessary. Otherwise, it's a new way of working.
Sure.
Building on what Saeeda has been saying, there is also a supplementary way of how to think about that. Anytime we set something which is completely dedicated, there is sometimes issues in, sharing. Sharing is caring. Sharing is difficult when you have a dedicated team, built out of the new people. At the same time, the core assets that we have, we already have. In particular, for established institutions, we have customers, we have specialists, we have touch points and things like that. So from the very practical standpoint, the places to start using the data actually are not very mysterious. They're very close to what is core of our P&L. One of the easiest way and simplest to start with is actually pricing. So using and utilizing data to drive propensity models and elasticity models on particular product lines, in particular deposits, as well as lending. That's where most of the value can get. And given that this is very surgical theme pertaining to one product line and only one technical domain, that's where you can actually get a lot of uplift without rechanging organization a lot. Second area to go after is credit. As this young startup, the FinTech, Credit Tech, actually operated by a bunch of young people, we had 50% advantage over incumbent banks across the countries in acceptance and risk. We had a disadvantage at funding, at collections, at scale, at let's say, the typical things that a bank would have and a small operation wouldn't, but actually where the data was applied, we had tremendous advantage. And just to give an example, 22% of improvement in risk underwriting was in observing the click stream and tap stream of how people fill out the order form. It had nothing to do with anything that is a normal indicator of credit worthiness. 22% improvement. Take your P&L in lending, apply 22% improvement on top of 500 lines of code and a bunch of machine learning algorithms, and actually you have an ROI that is up through the roof. The last element, which I think is most fundamental, is harvesting, ability to harvest commercially the touch points that we get in digital touch points. An example, any one of us before this panel stops will have touched their mobile device something like 12.4 times. The next branch visit you will have on average is 2 months from now. So unless we learn to harvest anything between 300 to 500 digital touchpoints that we have already right now in our digital channels, then we will we won't be able to be aligned with how customers live their lives, as well as improve the P&L. And that's the third element where the data application is absolutely fundamental. So being able to combine customer curricula around the digital DNA they have in order to create hundreds of live concurrent campaigns that then are actually going after micro targets and micro segments. And that's where you can arrive at anything between 70 to 90% of sales being done remotely out of the 500 touch points versus a couple of branch visits. And that's actually a reality, and it can be done. 3 applications of data: pricing, risk, digital sales.
Right. So, I think some excellent suggestions. So, on suggestions on how to practically take this forward within a bank, for the volume of data that exists and growing, for the speed at which, as Saeeda said, speed at which this needs to be delivered, at the point of transaction, and the plethora of touch points that we just heard about. This requires hypercompute. The banks cannot afford that. So until the banks are willing to take the serious journey into the cloud and are willing to take its data, anonymized data, whichever way we want to do this, and put it into the cloud and allow for it to be computed, I don't think this is going to happen, point one. Point two is the fact that you put it into the cloud, the level of AI capability that will unleash and make sense of this data and has to be commoditized, again, can only happen in the cloud.
That's right.
So, and within the banking space, still cloud is a no-fly zone. We're slowly getting there.
And actually, I have cloud, and I'm going to come back to that as one of our key things. But connected to data, the second real theme connected to data is this whole ecosystem marketplace play. So I think there are 2 parts to this. There's one part which is the banks with open APIs, opening through API gateways, connectivity to connect into the ecosystem and marketplace, connect to new fintechs more efficiently. So the architectural upgrade needed to be able to leverage the power of contextual as well as embedded banking services for customers in the marketplace or wherever they are is also becoming very vital. And if you see the success of the Chinese and also to some extent in other geographies, including in India and other places, I think the ability to look at payment systems, social media, and e-commerce put together in different areas is an ability to be able to provide customers an enormous ability to connect into their life. While banks have traditionally been very transactional, I do a mortgage, but the customer really needs the house and therefore needs a whole bunch of things for the house. Am I actually dealing and helping the customer with my partnerships to deal with the house rather than just focus on dealing with the digital transaction or the mortgage, which is also important but not the only thing. So I think the ability to connect all those pieces together from an ecosystem perspective, I think any of you all, if you have your thoughts of how, again, the banks are using that, because somewhere data is also important in that, in that mix.
So talking about ecosystems, and I understand an API readiness is fundamental to participate in the ecosystem. But the reality is the ecosystems are built and owned by the giants. So there hasn't been a commoditization of ecosystems. And unfortunately, the only thing that the banks do in these ecosystems is the Mickey Mouse payment. They don't do anything terribly sophisticated. as in they are not participating. But if we were to see how we leverage the data and monetize it in an ecosystem, I think the day trade and trade-related transactions enter the ecosystem, for which I think there is a very strong shift towards blockchain, because you need that railroads. Today's payment railroads are pretty basic, but to go to a sophisticated place, you do need the blockchain infrastructure. So my sense is it's a little away,
But
and
we seem,
once they evolve.
Sandeep, we seem like, at least with the open banking architecture, at least in some of these markets in UK and Europe, the reality of the ecosystem and people actually taking platforms on the ecosystem to connect, whether to data or other services, is seeming like it's more realistic because of the way in which the open banking mandate works. So I don't know, Michael, whether you have any thought about, the ecosystem, different geographies may be at different stages of evolution here. Do you see, it becoming easier for banks to connect into ecosystems? It looks like the others are doing it better than the banks.
There wouldn't be a good panel if there wouldn't be some disagreement. I think that we as bankers don't have to, and I think we shouldn't wait until the grand future of cloud or the grand future of blockchain arrives, because, well, who knows when it's really gonna be. And we have the business to run today and the customers who are at risk today, as well as opportunity to turn our competitors into client donors today and tomorrow, rather than a few years from now. And I think you can do a lot of great things before the new technology askers arrive. So just to give a few examples. So fundamentally, I believe that, from the ecosystem perspective, imagination that a bank would create their own ecosystems, e-commerce style. I've seen so many of those presentations, who hasn't, right? On the internet, from consultancies and all that. Well, in order to create anything like that, you would need to have probably at least 45% of the local market share to seed something like that, unless you would have created a consortium out of banks that would have provided the depth, the breadth, and the liquidity for a marketplace like that to actually, to exist. And of course, we know how easy it is to create banking consortia, not very easy, and to standardize a standard. It's a pity, but still. So creating those ecosystems, unless you are the dominant player in the market, probably is beyond the reach for someone who would have below 10%. Probably it's a waste of time. However, there is an ecosystem play that we already have in the bank. It's called a transaction. On any payment instrument we have the data that Google would kill for. We have the data that actually is the only reason that Google has ever entered into payments. And if we did the quiz, when Google entered into payment space, it was 2005. It was called Google Checkout. It died by natural death, 2 years later, but Google didn't give up, because Google cares about two things in the, super valuable that we have, they don't, which is, we see this for primary banking relationships, we have the 360 view of what customers do, not only on Alibaba, but also on Amazon and also in e-commerce, but primarily at the point of sale, which is still in most countries, more than 90% of customer spend. Only in China it has reached 14 or 15, and it's still only 13 and 14. Everything else is point of sale. We see that as bankers. And that basically is the semantics of life. That's the meaning of the commercial life of our customers. We see that. What we also have is ability to see when the transaction happened, actually almost in real time. This is the only reason Google is in payments. They don't care about the interchange fee. They care about those things. So we can actually create a mechanism for offers as well as financial instrument offers based on that stream. And this is something, to remember about. The other direction, so that would be on our internal customer platforms, those 500 touch points. The other way of how we should be exploring opportunity is to create ourselves the APIs for products that merchants or someone who has customer relationship will need in their value chain. In particular, what is value-based lending. So combining lending at the point of sale in physical retail, at the point of sale in digital retail, at classified sites and anything that connects buyers and sellers and be there with that product when the transactions and the deals are closed, this is something that we can produce. The only limitation is our internal capability to expose those APIs. And I was doing that at Credit Tech as a small FinTech, with the 1 minute checkout process, which was beating actually sometimes the payment instruments, and I was doing that also at mBank. And this is a fantastic and phenomenal business model that we can create that is around the ecosystem. So plugging ourselves into the ecosystem rather than imagining that we, with our market share, will create our own.
Yeah. So I think, the combination of the data and the open API model of connecting into an ecosystem obviously becomes very critical as you get into more contextual and banking. But to your earlier point that you brought out on the cloud, right? I think many of the banks started by sort of doubting the cloud, but seeing the reality of people who've gone to the cloud seems like a more secure and a more scalable and a more cost-effective solution than actually running the data centers that the banks ran traditionally. So I think the ability, based on what you think, is going to be the adoption of cloud products. Again, different geographies will be at different stages of evolution, but how do you sort of see, cloud evolution for the people in the room here? Should they be looking at, aggressively moving some products provided, they can legally do that, whether it's a private cloud or a hybrid model versus the traditional one? Is that going to help improve their ability to adopt new architecture more efficiently?
Okay. My view on the cloud. It's a cartel. Microsoft has announced in a year's time they will not develop a new product that is not only on the cloud. SAP has announced all new products only on cloud, no on-prem. Oracle has announced everything on the cloud. IBM only on the cloud. What are we debating? We don't have a choice. It's a mafia.
But I don't know
So,
whether...
the march to the cloud
Yeah.
is, Banesh, inevitable. The regulator has woken up to it. I can only speak more eloquently around the regulator here in the region. Is unbelievably progressive. They are working hand in glove with the banks here to prepare themselves to unleash the power of this new technology. Ecosystems will be born there. So the stuff that we just heard, all of that will come. So the cloud is here. Thankfully, there's been no big blow up in the cloud. So, so far so good. People continue to go in that direction.
So as a bank, how would you move your whole suite of services to the cloud? Do you have like an approach that you've thought about that you think people should be thinking about how they would do it? There are some banks in a few countries who are doing some kind of a lift and shift, but that's not necessarily, the ideal way to do it, but it's actually a start to it. So what do you feel is the way in which they should look at cloud deployment?
Yeah, see, living in a cloud ecosystem requires a very different set of engineering thinking. It's just right from the development stack, the tools, the monitoring, the publishing, and clearly the tech companies are already out there. So the reason that they are, the big tech particularly are at the doors of these banks, the gates of these banks, is because they have created the infrastructural readiness to launch anything at scale. So for a bank to take traditional platforms and move them onto this new stack, I know that Intellect is working with its new stack that it's launching at least in the corporate banking side that I'm aware of, is the way to go. That the product providers or the solution providers will bring cloud native capabilities.
Absolutely. And I think from an Intellect perspective, I think the focus has, and you've seen some of the corporate stuff, but there's similarly the retail stuff is also completely modeled around the same architecture to move completely to the cloud.
It's
So
a
I think
mafia, I'm telling you.
And I think it's a mafia, but it's here to stay. And I think, folks, Michael, do you have any thoughts about cloud in a sense? I mean, is this moving faster in some places over others, or?
So maybe except for the mafia part, sometimes there is just a natural platform consolidation. I think that would be the kind of the economic term for this. But well, it's inevitable. It's a new computing. Well, it still does the same thing, really. It just computes the bits, right, and it transfers the bits. It's just set up on a technology S-curve that gives us not only superior scalability but also outsourcing, so to speak, right? The layers. It creates a layer of abstraction and a lot of noise that we shouldn't be running because we are a bank. Can be outsourced to a vendor and they do it for us, right? So layers, the development layers, security layers, optimization layers, all that sort of thing, which basically, of course, is the premise for having a faster development cycle and simpler and easier organization. So moving there is inevitable. But I think that it definitely will not be a revolution.
One of the things that
it's not a revolution.
One of the things that we were figuring out is how do you do that, right, as a bank?
Yes.
So do you do it in a progressive modernization
So
approach?
there is no other option, because if it was so easy to basically say, tomorrow we are on the cloud, probably, 80% of banking would have done that. And also, if it was easy to transform the way we run the business, the banking would have been transformed and already would have been running 80% of digital sales because our clients are already there and not in the branches, really.
See, the IBM platforms have not shown up on the cloud. So it's only largely the x86 Intel platforms that are out there. So it's a tough one for banks to systemically stand up and take their whole stack and say, okay, I can move 10% each year or 20% each year. So it requires a very fundamental shift of the underlying infrastructure stack that it runs on. I know between IBM and Oracle, they're coming with something.
I think IBM has been talking to us about some
Right,
of the data centers that they are presently processing across Asia and other markets, of trying to move it into that same data center into a private cloud model.
So that's why I feel that it'll be a product-led. So the product providers, Intellect, etc., they will bring all their solutions that are cloud ready. They will handhold the banks and the other companies to go to the cloud.
Yeah.
The bank's own understanding of how to get there is difficult. The other piece that is holding us back is this whole data residency, not data privacy. I think we can be pretty sure that the data is protected, but the data residency in the case of exit and the rules governing that, yes, my entire data has got, been deleted, is in the cloud, et cetera. So those are some issues that still need to be solved.
I would offer two kind of shorthand approaches. One is crawl, walk, run. Jumping with the revolution without the proper preparation is probably quite suicidal. So unless we have teams and routines where we would have trained what it means to set up a cloud workload or an application or a customer-facing service, and then also having teams, procedures, process, operating model for that, and then making big decisions, probably, we are bankers, we manage risks, not take risks. So crawl, walk, run is definitely the way to go. And the other would be the litmus test of how much of that cloud workload do we have yet. And I would risk a golden rule at that point of time, unless we have 10-15% of workloads already. That might not be mission critical, but at least 10 to 15% of our internal development teams or vendors, as well as workloads, are not on the cloud yet. That means that we haven't crawled yet. And
I think it brings out an interesting point related to the type of skill and resources that are presently there in the organization versus what is needed for this transition and operating model, both mentally from a cultural mindset as well as the technical support that's required to move some of these things, right? I think to some extent, to your point, you have to start somewhere and start building some kind of a plan on that.
See, the shift that I know Intellect is taking is it's moving to software as a service. So the day you've commoditized your offering,
it's easier to operate.
It's easier to, and also to the other point Michael's making, your crawl, walk, run, etc. is fine, but the day you put your stake in the ground, that I'm cloud first. That day onwards, you can't play on both sides of the equation.
Yeah.
That day onwards, you say to everybody who shows up at your door, listen, if you ain't cloud ready, I can't go to dance with you. So from that day onwards, everything moves. It's development, test, etc. And they've got to handhold you and take you there. And there's plenty of capability out in the tech world. Because clearly banking is late to the party. The cloud's been around for 15 years. Healthcare and retail for sure, etc. Airline. A lot of this fintech is born in the cloud. So this will take some time for it to show up.
Yeah.
Regulations like on GDPR and stuff in Hong Kong, etc., don't help the matter in the boardroom. In the boardroom, the subject is still very cloudy and not fully understood. So it gets hard because the people in the board are hearing about these draconian GDPR style penalties and obligations that banks have to comply. On the other hand, they hear about how
Data can be.
How virtual the concept of the cloud is. So there's got to be shift in that.
Sure.
So
And I think just to add to that, right, be it cloud, be it data, be it whatever we're talking about, one of the biggest issues that we run into time and time again is they tend to be so compartmentalized and siloed. You know what, Sandeep, you are the COO, it is your responsibility. It doesn't quite work that way because the implications of whether you are or you're not are very far-reaching. They will impact all the way to the front line, to the business, to the products, to how quickly you can service your customers. And I think until that view is taken, that really and truly this is being done, not simply because someone in technology woke up one day and thought, hey, that's a nice new thing, let's think about doing that. I think unless that is brought to the forward and taken in the view of this is being done for the customer,
Sure.
this is being done for the business, it's very difficult to mobilize the organization behind it.
Okay, I think we can talk lots on this, but in the interest of time, I think let's see if there's some questions around any of these themes or ideas. I mean, I did want to talk a little bit about the changing cultural mindsets in organizations to be able to implement a digital strategy, because I think lots of folks that we talk to struggle with getting their own organization to start thinking differently, to implement a digital bank or a digital challenger bank, and all the way to your points that we talked about, whether it was data, whether it was cloud, implementing the challenger digital bank in that new sort of framework is one way to sort of start crawling. And I know we don't have too much time on this, but let me, is there anything else you want to touch on?
I mean, it's a slightly extreme question, but the question is to Arun. Given that banks are trying to get on and compete, and its competition is technology, given how successful Arun has been in building a technology company that serves banks, could you become a bank tomorrow?
Yeah.
Because there's nothing that a bank needs more than what you give. So why can't you be a bank?
So this attraction is always there as a vendor that once we know the technology, why shouldn't we be a bank? But I think if you are servicing 240 different banks and being partnered with their journeys and enabling those banks, it's important that we listen to those 240 customers and live their dream and work with them rather than competing with them.
But Arun often, just off the record, right? Arun often says, why should we not monetize some of our products in technology and actually start a bank? Or a version of a bank, could be a lending bank, could be a payment bank, could be any version. But we have 250 banks that we can help who sort of stuck with a whole bunch of legacies. And to your point, if we can have the software as a service model with a cloud infrastructure ready, to be able to plug in and do services for, but actually help them in a partnership mode to progressively modernize this legacy. And I think that is the discussion we constantly have. I know KS has it all the time. And I think the ability to somehow make that happen and still move the equation forward in the new architecture. Because I think in the last few years, lots of things have been done on the front end.
Yeah,
to
so
make it
Banesh,
look like
just what we are discussing over the lunch with Michael, the thinking is that are banks changing their procurement process, the governance process of procuring new systems, new technologies, and the partnership models? And there's a huge opportunity, banks to do almost like a special purpose vehicle, SPVs with the Intellect, to work on certain high risk investments, but with a risk and reward shared equally. So I think those models we need to explore in monetizing experience, that which bank internally may not be able to do it, because internally, as Saeeda puts it, you need a different team, you need, so, and those different teams to create within a bank sometimes becomes much more difficult than what we want to do it. But with a partner like Intellect, there could be a joint design thinking team working together on certain different cost structures and the pricing models, not currently the RFP based models. To me, if we are looking for what we are discussing in the morning, if it has to change, this model should not be the same old model. You prepare a RFP in 12 months time, submit to the people for next 6 months, you implement the system in next 18 months, 3 years are gone. And when you start leveraging the system, again you pull out the team, because the value of the system is realized only when it goes live. And that time the teams is pulled out. So it's a fundamental shift.
New paradigm, for sure.
And we've seen a lot of it. By the time it gets implemented, it's pretty much legacy by its own making, thanks to the time it takes. Yeah.
But Arun, that paradigm will happen in our lifetime. I'm telling you, it's your direction of travel in your mind's eye is not unreal. It will happen. I think people are coming around to it.
Yeah, that's good. Any questions from anybody? No, that's good. Thank you. Thanks to the panel.